Over the last few weeks, we've had key figures in the Labour front bench, including Keir Starmer himself, making a number of kind of deeply reactionary statements around migration. So, in his conference speech, Keir Starmer talked about a points-based immigration system. You've seen, Rachel Reeves talking about more people needing to be deported, and that's the problem with the current Tory immigration policy. Starmer again has said that, the NHS is over-reliant on migrant workers. And you had Stephen Kinnock the other day talking about reintroducing ID cards. Um, what do you? Some of these things appear to be Labour policy, some of them don't, but they all appear to be bad news. What do you understand the Labour Party's current migration policy to be?
To be completely honest with you, I'm not even sure the front bench knows what its immigration policy is. As you've rightly said, a lot of these announcements are not actual policies. They're dog whistles, they're kind of vibes, they're meant to reassure people who are anti-immigration. But very few of them are anything concrete. Like the ID cards thing, Yvette Cooper then came on the news saying it's not actually policy. Truth is, we don't know. Like, talking about points-based system, like a points-based system is a very vague term that actually means very little. It means not free movement. It's basically a dog whistle signaling there's going to be some kind of tough on immigration arrangement, bringing to mind Australia that's famous for its brutal border regime. But in practical terms, it doesn't actually say very much. I think basically Labour wants to avoid the topic altogether, send kind of mixed signals. Obviously, when Keir Starmer stood for leadership, he stood on progressive pledges, including to defend migrant rights. Now he seems to be rolling back, but with very few specifics. So fundamentally, I can imagine if Labour does get into power, being very susceptible to pressure from either side, because immigration is simply not a topic that they seem very ideologically committed to having a specific vision for what the system should look like.
So I'm going to come on to, I guess, that question about pressure and how the Labour Party's position could be shifted. But naturally, so you're from Labour Campaign for Free Movement. Obviously, you take a very different perspective on migration to that which has been put forward by the Labour front bench. So what would your ideal of an immigration system look like?
So as a campaign, we have a motion that we've been putting forward to local parties and to Labour conference nationally as well, which kind of lays out some of the key policies that you would want to see. I mean, firstly, ending all hostile environment measures. We don't actually know what Labour's current policy is on the hostile environment. It's not been clear, but things like, right to work checks on restrictions of migrants using the NHS, like all of that needs to go. Ending detention. Nobody should be in prison just because of where they're from. I think that should be very clear. Giving asylum seekers the right to work. It makes no sense that there is refugees in this country who've been around sometimes for years, waiting for their claims to be processed, who can't even get a job. A very important one, abolishing no recourse to public funds. So a policy that means migrants are not able to claim benefits. If something goes wrong, not able to kind of claim housing support, that means a lot of people end up being homeless and destitute. We saw the impacts of that in the pandemic when people lost their jobs. Like that policy needs to go. We also talk about giving migrants the right to vote. I think that's an important one because politics shouldn't just be something that's being done to us. Very often we see panels on immigration full of white English men with no actual migrants involved. We think migrants are people with agency, and that's why the right to vote for people who live here, pay taxes here, have to follow the laws here. It just makes sense for us to also have a say. Then we're also talking about pursuing free movement agreements, possibly tied to trade deals. Obviously, our campaign launched during the kind of Brexit debate, where EU free movement was still on the table. Now, whether that's free movement with Europe or with other countries, we think a can of beans should not have more right to move than a human being does. And finally, I think it's important for the Labour Party and for our movement to challenge reactionary narratives. When the Tories, go on the news talking about migrant invasion, using language that provokes terrorist attacks, Labour should be not just criticizing them on competence, but actively pushing back. because what people think about immigration is not a result of what impacts their lives. Immigration numbers, it's not the immigration numbers and anti-migrant sentiment. What does shape public opinion is what people see in the news, and that's why it's so important to have alternative voices in the Labour Party and beyond.
So before I come on to the next question, for people watching, please do pop questions in the chat on YouTube or on social media, and we'll try and pick up as many of them as we can in the time that we've got. So you talked a little bit earlier about, I guess, you feeling that the Labour Party will be susceptible to pressure on migration from either side, particularly, I guess, the next Labour government. Um, I guess the counter argument to that is that there's a massive gulf between the kinds of policies and vision that you've kind of articulated there and what the Labour Party is currently kind of pushing from its leadership and from the front bench, and also over the last 2 years you've seen the hollowing out of the left within the Labour Party. You've seen masses of left-wing members either leaving or being kicked out of the party. So what does the strategy look like in that context for shifting the Labour Party's position on migration?
There's a few different sides to our strategy. Firstly, what we've always done is been kind of speaking inside the party, speaking to members, passing motions in local parties, passing motions at conference, writing to kind of like Labour-specific publications like Labour List, making that argument from the grassroots. And there's also a lot of good stuff that's happening. Local immigration, we've previously done work with local government to get, for example, councils to fund free school meals for migrant children, or to remove home office officers, to not collaborate with hostile environment. In my constituency Labour Party in Camberwell and Peckham, we've got Labour councillors and the party itself supporting like anti-raids networks. That kind of local work is also very valuable. Secondly, we have a kind of parliamentary strategy. We've previously written to all Labour MPs and candidates. I will be doing this again, asking them to pledge to support migrants, trying to have these conversations with individual MPs. And we have had very vocal supporters, people like Nadia Whittam, who's been with our campaign for a very long time, Paul Sweeney, the MSPs in Scotland, Clive Lewis, various sort of high-profile Labour figures who have been making that case that we're advocating. But then, as well as trying to kind of gain more support within the party, I think it's also important to speak to the country and speak to our society. And that's why we've organized protests. We've gone on protests recently at the Manchester Detention Centre. Sometimes we organize kind of Labour blocks to go on pro-migrant protests. Try to kind of get in the news beyond just Labour, because as I said, like Labour is susceptible to what's happening on the ground and to shifts in public opinion. And we know that public opinion on immigration can change very very quickly, depending on the kind of stories people hear. So yeah, speaking both out on inside and outside of the party is what we're trying to do.
So my final question to you, before I bring in any questions that come in from the chat. So a lot of people who'll be watching this stream will be either members or supporters of the Greens. And some of them will be thinking, look, the Labour Party again is playing into the right and the Tories game on migration, just as they did in the 2010s under Ed Miliband, or as they did under Blair and Brown. This is the Labour Party reverting to type. And actually, if you want a party that supports free movement, if you want a party that supports migrants, then the Green Party is the party that offers that. Why are they wrong?
I wouldn't say necessarily they're wrong. What I would say is that realistically, progressive change in this country will happen through a Labour-led government. Obviously, that's not the only way a change happens, right? We need activism on the ground, but we also need a government that's at least susceptible to pressure from the grassroots. With the Tories, I mean, they're dead set on attacking migrants. partly even to distract from their own economic failures, for how much they're failing working class people. They want to direct anger towards migrants. That's their ideology. Whereas a Labour government could be more open to being influenced. And realistically, we're on their first past the post, right? Like, much as there is a lot of wonderful people in the Green Party who do brilliant work, realistically, it will have to be at least a Labour-led government that will introduce progressive change in this country. I mean, the other argument I make is that Labour has been historically and is the party of trade unions. And I think if we're making the argument about migrants also being workers, the argument that the way to stop undercutting wages is not to close the borders, but is to organize and strike, I think it's important to be active within the kind of Labour movement, and the political representation of that has historically been the Labour Party. So that's the reasons why personally I'm a Labour member, and why I think it's important to, even though it can be an uphill struggle and be frustrating, engage with the kind of Labour movement we have.
So I said it was my last question, but actually what you just said there has triggered another one. So you talked there about trade unions and the labour movement playing an important role in this question, and over the last few months we've seen the PCS play a quite important role in resisting the government's anti-migrant policies, because of course the PCS represents and is the union for people who work in the border force, and so they have opposed. For example, the attempts to push back boats, have opposed the Rwanda deportation policy, all the kind of most hideous aspects of the kind of government's policies. So what would you like to see trade unions doing more of in fighting for a fairer migration system?
No, you're completely right. Without workers, no deportation flight can take off. No detention center can function. There is no deportation rates without the people who implement that. And equally in the NHS, we've seen doctors and other NHS staff organizing against the hostile environment, making a case for healthcare to be truly universal. I think it's massively important for unions to take on that fight, to say, firstly, we don't want to be complicit in any anti-migrant measures, but also those with maybe less of a direct link. We've seen, for example, the Firefighters Union, FBU, consistently take a very progressive pro-migrant position. The Bakers Union equally, making the case they represent all working class people, regardless what the passport says. And yeah, I think the more we hear that, the more we hear the case that the enemy is not a neighbor, a colleague with a foreign accent. The enemy is exploitative bosses and the Tories. The more we can really unite people and win not just for migrants, but win for the entire working class.
Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm sure that's triggered lots of thoughts in people who are watching, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, Anna.
Thank you so much.